Hello, everybody. Good morning. We're going to start this session. As you know, this is the session that will be on metaphysics. So I just want you to know that we're going to have 20 minutes per speaker, and then 10 minutes of Q&A for that speaker, and then at the end, a last 15-minute Q&A that involves all of them. So good morning. My name is Ernesto Fuentes, Padgett, and I'm a graduate student at the Medieval Institute doing a PhD in medieval studies, and I'll be your chair. We're going to start promptly now. So in this session, we have three speakers. Professor Michael Gorman, Ordinary Professor of Philosophy at the Catholic University of America. We have Gregory T. Doolan, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the Catholic University of America. And Father Stephen Brock, Professor of Medieval Philosophy at the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross. I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Professor Gorman is a professor of philosophy at the Catholic University of America, where he has taught since 1999. He has published 2 books and almost 40 articles, most of them on metaphysics or metaphysics-adjacent topics. His paper today is titled Aquinas and the Question of What There Is. You can start.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So, the title of my paper is Aquinas and the Question of What There Is. Now, the issue is something like this. Most people would agree that when we speak in a way that suggests that something's there, it's not always there. So, for example, if I were to say the tallest person in this room is 6'5", that would imply that someone in this room is 6'5". But if I were to say that the average person in this room is 6'5", that would not imply that anyone in this room was 6'5", or whatever number I said. You know what I mean? Okay. And so what that means is if you just read off from the things we say casually the list of all the beings that there are, you're going to make a certain number of mistakes. So the question is, what's really there, cutting through the superficial appearances of the way we just tend to speak about things? And so our question is, how does Aquinas come down on this? What for Aquinas are the real beings? Now, before addressing this question, I want to bring out both a restriction and a clarification. Or maybe the clarification should be better called a warning. The restriction is simple. My discussion will be restricted to the question of which are the created beings. The sense in which God is and isn't a being will not come up here. As for the clarification, I think it's hard to be sure what Aquinas' view on this topic really is. He spends very little time addressing our questions in any sort of detail. They seem not to have been of central concern to him. Whether there is a God, whether private property is natural, whether you need to pay attention while you are praying, these are questions that Aquinas handled explicitly and in some detail, but not so for the question of what there is. He never gives us a nice, fat, juicy presentation like the one I wish he had given. So I'm going to give you a fantasy text that I hope someone discovers. It's called Quaestio Disputata de Entibus. Just one question. Article 1, whether there are any beings. Article 2, whether substances are beings. Article 3, whether only substances are beings. Article 4, whether Aristotle enumerated the categories of being correctly. Article 5, whether substantial forms are beings. Article 6, whether matter is a being. Article 7, whether privations and negations are beings, and so on. But we don't have this text. So while I do have a proposal to make, I want to make clear it's a tentative proposal. I stress this if only as a warning to myself, a warning not merely to zoom in on whatever idea passes my personal Thomistic vibe check and label it Aquinas' ontology. With little in the way of textual support or exegetical clarifications, and maybe, who knows, on a deeper level, the warning has to be not just to use Aquinas as a stalking horse for whatever I think is right. Okay, so what for Aquinas are the beings? In A recent article, Robert Pasnow has argued that for Aquinas, what there is substance. So when push comes to shove, the only beings are the substances, and everything else is the way we talk. Accidents, forms, all of it. You can find other authors who at least appear to say the same thing. Just for fun, I'll mention Garrigou-Lagrange. I think, though, that this is not the correct interpretation of Aquinas, but that doesn't mean it isn't worth talking about. Working through these matters turns out, at least in my view, to be very interesting. So in my paper, I cut one possible path through this thicket. I begin by, and the way I'm going to do it is there's a set of texts, and then there's a different set of texts, and then there's a different set of texts, and then there's a fourth set of texts. But I'm only going to give you one from each because I don't have a lot of time. So I begin by setting out a few texts that I call categories and beings texts. And here's a snippet from one of them. So this is the first text on your handout. The philosopher shows that being is said in a number of ways. In one way, what's divided among the 10 genera is called being. And in this way, being signifies something existing in nature, whether it be a substance, like a human being, or an accident, like a color. In another way, what signifies the truth of a proposition is called being. So passages like these, I claim, show that for Aquinas, not only substances are beings, I mean real beings. Real being is divided among the 10 categories. So accidents, too, are beings. Then things get tricky. I turn to the magis entis quam ens texts. These seem to show that accidents are not beings after all. So here's an example. It's the second thing on your handout. This is slightly excerpted, and because Pasnow uses this text importantly in his own interpretation, I'm quoting in his translation. Existence, or esse, is attributed to a thing in two ways. In one way, as to that which properly and truly has existence, or is, and in this way it is attributed only to a substance that it subsists through itself. Thus, Physics 1 says that a substance is what truly is. All those things, on the other hand, that do not subsist through themselves, but are in another and with another, for example, accidents, do not have existence in such a way that they truly are, but existence is attributed to them in another way, that is, as that by which something is. Just as whiteness is said to be not because, it subsists in itself, but because by it something has existence as white. Therefore, existence properly and truly is attributed only to a thing that subsists on its own. Passages like these appear to make it difficult to uphold the claim that for Aquinas, accidents too are beings. But I think that when read in context, they don't really create a serious difficulty. For example, the passage just quoted comes on the heels of Aquinas' making a distinction like the one he made in the categories and beings text that I quoted earlier. Aquinas distinguishes real beings from mere beings of reason, not that he uses that terminology there, and it's within the former, within real beings, that he says that only substances are what, quote, properly and truly exist. So in a nutshell, I think that what Aquinas has to mean in this sort of text is that substances exist in the primary sense and that accidents exist in some secondary sense. But then things get trickier still. There are what I call accidentia sive formae texts. These are texts in which Aquinas speaks of accidents and forms in one breath, and maybe of other things too. He sometimes says, oh so breezily, accidents, forms, and things like that. Okay. So a part of the previous text, now unexcerpted, can serve as an example of the third type of text. This is the third text on your handout now. Physics 1 says that a substance is what truly is. All those things, on the other hand, that do not subsist through themselves, but are in another and with another, here's the unexcerpted bit now, accidents or substantial forms or any parts whatsoever, do not have existence in such a way that they truly are, but existence is attributed to them in another way. This text creates a difficulty, a different sort of difficulty. If accidents are on a par with, say, substantial forms, then we have a different and less easy to solve problem with the view that real beings are the ones in the categories. If real beings are the ones in the categories, one might think, then real beings are going to be either substances or accidents. But substantial forms, for example, are neither substances nor accidents. And that leads to a dilemma. If they, substantial forms, aren't beings, then maybe accidents aren't either. Or if accidents are beings, then maybe substantial forms are as well. So to get out of this, I move to a fourth class of texts, the per reductionem texts. According to them, belonging to a category comes in two forms or two ways. You can belong to a category directe, straightforwardly, or per reductionem. Here's an example. Last block text. In substances, from matter and form, there comes to be something one through itself, by means of a certain nature resulting from the joining of them both, something which is properly placed in the category of substance, but form or matter are not in the category in this way, except per reductionem, as principles are said to be in a genus. Now, Aquinas does not use this language of per reductionem often, nor does he ever, as far as I am aware, spell out nice and explicitly what it means. And perhaps that explains why so little scholarly attention has been paid to it. I think he means roughly this, and now you get the first thing on your handout that's not a quotation, a hypothesis about that part. So I think he means roughly this. Something belongs to a category C, per reductionem, if and only if, first, it's not a C, and two, its being or nature is tied to C's. We'll just hold off on there for now. So, for example, a substantial form isn't a substance, but the being or nature of a substantial form is tied up with substance. So therefore, a substantial form belongs to the category of substance, not straightforwardly directing, but per reductionem. It can be traced back to it, if you will. Now, I said that this was roughly what per reductionem membership comes to, so I should explain the qualifier. The account that I just gave implies, it would seem, that accidents belong to the category of substance, per reductionem, right? Because accidents aren't substances, but they are what they are with regard to substances. Aquinas never addresses this, as far as I know. But, it just doesn't sound right. So I suspect that we need some third criterion here, and maybe it's just something as simple as 3 here. The something belongs to a category C. Third criterion, it does not belong to any other category directly. I don't know, that's pretty blunt. In any event, items that show up in categories per reductionem are in various ways principles of the items that show up in the categories straightforwardly or directing. So, for example, a substantial form is a principle of a substance. If, as some Thomists hold, accidents have their own little mini actus essendi, those would be principles of accidents, you see. I think the distinction between direct and per reductionem category membership helps us understand Aquinas' views on what there is. Substances are indeed what exist in the primary sense, but it turns out that there are 2 different ways for something to exist in a secondary sense. I think the same thing. One way is for something to exist directly in an accidental category. The other way is for something to exist in a category only per reductionem, whether that category be the category of substance or some accidental category. So to sum up my main results, and now you can just read along on the hand now for the last little while. There is the distinction between beings of reason and real beings, this latter, real beings, corresponding to the members of the 10 categories. There is also within real being a distinction among the various categories. Finally, within each category, there is a distinction between the primary members and the secondary members, those that belong directe and those that belong only per reductionem. So the answer to the question of what there is for Aquinas is best answered in multiform fashion. Restricting our attention to creation, of course, we can say that what there is includes substances, but also accidents, admittedly in a secondary way, and finally also the principles of substances and accidents. These last, again, in a secondary, but a differently secondary way. Now, all this remains, one might fear, somewhat at a verbal level. Thinking it through philosophically is a different and a deeper matter. In a preliminary way, I do some of that towards the end of the full paper by talking about two things. First, how substances differ from accidents. And I talk about the way in which accidents in their essences contain what you might call a reference to substance. And second, I say some things about how accidents differ from other non-accidental principles of being, for example, from substantial forms. Accidents enhance beings that are, so to speak, already there. But essential ontological principles, like substantial forms, constitute beings in the first place. But I don't really have time to get into all of that, and anyway, I want to hear from you. So that's it. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was about the last tradition of text, the Reduction text. I was wondering, maybe it could be helpful to look at Aquinas' commentary. I don't think he uses the Reduction language there, but in his commentary on Book 7, Chapter 3, when Aristotle starts the discussion of what is substance, and it takes into account, is it matter substance, is it form substance? It looks like Aquinas there, if I remember correctly, he says that form is substance in a derivative way, and matter is substance in a derivative way.
Yeah.
So it looks like there is a kind of like primary-secondary relation, similar to substance accidents.
Yeah.
With respect, because there is a kind of like explanatory criterion, like what is that makes something a substance, and form is substance in the sense that is the principle, the main principle that is responsible for the substantiality of a thing. So
right.
It's substance in a secondary way, and matter is substance.
Yeah, no, that's a good suggestion. Yeah, thank you. That's a good suggestion because, of course, this is that part of the metaphysics where Aristotle is just like, now I'm going to fake everyone out. And I'm familiar with some of the things Aquinas says and trying to deal with that, but not all of it. So I'm going to double check that. Thank you. Thank you. It's good. Okay. Gosh, so many aggressive people over here. We'll start in the middle with Jeff, and then.
Thank you for that topic. So I really like it that you added things other than just substances to the list of beings. But I wondered if I just wondered about your claim that there are beings corresponding to each of the accidental categories, and I wonder what you'd say about texts where action, passion are the same motion.
Yeah. So if you pick, I don't know if this is literally true, but roughly, as you go farther along the list of categories, they get weirder and weirder. Right? So the more, sort of tighter version of this, it's not that every being belongs to exactly one category, but that every being belongs to at least one category. Yeah, so it belongs to, I don't know, maybe I've misformulated it here somewhere. Each being belongs to a category. but not maybe to exactly one. And action and passion are a great example of you can't, the one-to-one thesis is very nice and tidy, but it just doesn't seem right. Yeah, thank you, yeah. Okay.
Okay, somewhat similar to Francesco, I think. My mind went to Metaphysics Book 7, but kind of from a different angle. I was thinking, originally my mind went there for the same reasons. But I wanted to say that some scholars of Aristotle think that either his conception of substance or what he thinks counts as substances may have changed between the categories in the metaphysics.
Right.
And some think that in the metaphysics, he really does seem to think that substantial form is primary, what substance form is the primary instance of substance, which is a change from his categories. But related to that, and when it comes to Thomas Aquinas and what he says about being, everybody, of course, goes to de ente et essentia. But we all know this was written very early in Aquinas' career. And I've always had questions about, are we correct in sort of assuming that the sort of like very basic metaphysical questions he treats there are themes that he consistently maintains in his daily life? I was wondering if you're interested in
Sure.
that.
No, that's good. So, yeah, so as for the first question, as far as I can tell, Aquinas, he seems unworried, and maybe this is a good thing or maybe it's a bad thing, but he seems unworried about, maybe Aristotle changed his mind. He seems really unworried about, like, maybe metaphysics isn't really a book after all. It's just a bunch of papers that someone drove a staple through. He just doesn't worry about stuff like that. And so he seems Aquinas, it seems to me, generally pushes Aristotle back towards holding that, in the end, substance means a suppositum, a subsisting whole, that kind of thing. Yeah, you should not assume, one should not assume, I should just say, I should be careful not to, I love the de ente. I have to be careful not to assume that it just speaks for Aquinas his whole career. I mean, he is a remarkably consistent thinker from, his earliest works. So much of it seems to be there already, but it's not true always. Yeah, but I don't have like a pattern or a rule for this. You just have to be sensitive to, individual situations. Francis?
Thank you so much. You had mentioned that some Thomists hold the activists have their own individual little activist society lists, something like that. And I know that's a disputed question, but I think it's fairly clear that Aquinas at least sometimes says that accidents give a secondary being to their substance.
That's right.
And so I guess my question is, would you say that accidents are real by that secondary, so if they count as beings in a secondary way, like is it the substance existence that's like contributing to their reality, or is it like their own accidental?
I just haven't made up my mind. Yeah. That's a really, really tough one. I just have not yet gone through the labor of working through all those texts. Yeah, sorry, I'm just going to dodge that.
Cool. So thanks. This was great. A suggestion.
Yeah.
A fifth set of texts that you might want to add are the Ensia Peroccidens, because those will aggregate, I think, more like what you're doing with the being only in the sense of true. Because he says there that they are beings in name only. And that in name only language comes up a couple places throughout the corpus.
Yes. But wait, if those just sort of line up with the beings of reason, then I can just, okay. Oh, I see, they overlap.
So, because
Yes.
what you want to say beings of reason are not real, right? And then you
Right.
want to say, so they're not going to count in our ontology.
Yeah.
But these other ones, the real beings, that's where you're focusing. Where do Ensia Peroccidens?
Oh, I see. Yeah.
I think you're going to say the same,
Gotcha.
something similar to what you
Yes.
said about beings of reason, but for different reasons.
Yeah. No, that's true. I tend, if I get where you're going with this, I do tend to think that Aquinas' approach to them is pretty deflationary. But that's a disputed question. It's disputed even in the row of this room that you're sitting in. So like, it's pretty tricksy, and I just don't get into it here. But I am working on that on a different project. Yeah.
So it seems like the view you're kind of contending with is a sort of modal picture of accidents, in particular, making them kind of a mode of substances, which I know is the tendency of thinkers like Occam. It seems to me that a lot of this dispute about what beings there are comes down to a kind of desire on our part to treat being as univocal and to look for this one single thing that we call being that we can classify everything as. And Aquinas refuses to ever go that way. I mean, explicitly, denies it. If you're not talking about God, at least, if you're talking about created being, I mean, he's very consistently goes like, look, there is no single kind of being that we can point to. Everything is a being in a different sense.
Yeah. Okay. So the first part of the question, to think of whether accidents are modes of substances, that depends on what you mean, what you think a mode is, So we'd have to walk through that in a lot of detail. But I mean, it's sort of the main burden of my paper to defend the idea that for Aquinas, there's more than one kind of being, right? There are substances and there are accidents which are very different, but they are still beings. And then I was dragged to this sort of kicking and screaming, but I think Aquinas grants a kind of status as if they were kind of, sort of beings, even to principles of beings, like form and matter and things like that. So I would have said offhand that the way I was presenting this is strongly in favor of analogy of being and strongly against a univocal sense of being. But if it sounds like I'm defending the univocity of being for Aquinas, then, okay, yeah, I was going to say, I've done something really wrong.
I think I'm agreeing with you.
Okay, yeah. No, I think that's, yeah, it turns out there's a lot of trickiness involved in univocity and analogy of being. And, the sort of old idea that Aquinas was good because he believed in analogy of being and Scotus was bad because he believed in univocity of being, that is so oversimplified that, but yeah, I know what you mean. Aquinas is pretty hardcore about this. I think that's right. Mm-hmm. When do I need to stop? One more. Okay. You just got
this is actually a good transition from this question. I'm wondering, would Aquinas understand the question?
Yes.
And I guess what I mean is that I think obviously Aquinas asked this question.
Right.
In a straightforward way. And I don't think Aquinas takes himself to be presupposing a substantive thesis that being is univocal. But I think that
yes, I think that's true.
He's talking about a univocal sense of being. And so I actually think that if we're going to ask the question for Aquinas and have it be the same question that Aquinas is asking, for Aquinas it's going to be, because Aquinas doesn't think of, so Aquinas' version of being is something like, it is there in some sense.
Yeah.
Right? For Aquinas, it's going to have to be something like that. In some sense, it's there.
Well, if that's what you mean by a univocal sense of being, it's not so bad.
It's not so
bad.
No, I'm totally for it. I just don't think, as musicians say, it doesn't carve the world into joints, right? In the right way.
Well, there are no joints in that picture, yeah.
I think that's so
because the in some way just smears over them all. Yeah, no.
Right, that's what I mean. It's this big disjunctive sort of
Right.
So I think that maybe in asking it, like in the paper, if you're talking about that question, you might not want to say that things exist in different senses. Because I think Quine would just say, and I think actually rightly, given its concept of being, that the concept of things existing in different senses doesn't compute.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that a lot of the literature has played out in the wake of Quine has sort of taken Quine, not without reason, to be operating with a pretty univocal notion of being. And some of the ways in which people have pushed back against Quine is by talking about ontological pluralism and quantifier variance and all of this stuff. I think there's probably a way to read Quine himself as posing a question that's sort of naively prior to those distinctions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he's not asking the more fine-grained questions that points.
Right. No, I think that's right. I think that's right. Yeah. Okay, so I'm being told to stop, so
If
it's
there
fine.
are more questions,
No, no,
we
it's
will
good.
continue
It's good.
this, 15-minute
No, I'm
Q&A
grateful.
at the end.
Thank you. No. I don't know whether you can touch it.
Oh, please. Okay.
I don't know.
Am I allowed to move this?
You need
don't-
this?
Yeah, I'd like to put my laptop here.
Yeah, he will help you. I'm
I
going
can,
to introduce you
can
while
just put
he
it
does
here.
that.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Now we're going to continue with our second speaker.
If that's okay, you could just,
Connected to that?
yeah, or, oh, are you connecting? Yeah. let's
No,
do
I'm
it.
not connecting anything. I'm just reading.
Oh, it's just for you.
Great.
Oh,
Yeah, just
okay.
put it
Yeah,
right
you can
on-
put
just put it right on top.
Okay.
After
So, perfect. So our second speaker is Professor Gregory T. Doolan. He received his PhD in philosophy from the Catholic University of America in 2003, where he now teaches as an associate professor of philosophy. And his research interests in this area of Aquinas metaphysics is in this area of Aquinas metaphysics, and more recently on Aquinas' account of the Aristotelian categories of being and the intersection between semantics and metaphysics. He's the author of Aquinas and the Divine Ideas as Exemplar Causes, the editor of The Science of Being as Being, Metaphysical Investigations, and most recently co-edited with Professor Therese Corey the volume Summa Metaphysicae ad Mentem Sancti Thomae, Essays in Honor of John F. Whipple. His paper today is titled Aquinas on Establishing the Subject of Metaphysics, Separating Fact from Fiction about the Role of Separatio.
I have a handout, hopefully that it made its way around the room. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, thanks for coming to this session. This event is great. It's like a big family reunion for Thomists. This is with any family, though. There's squabbles sometimes, and there's no fight quite like a family fight. This paper is concerned with one of those contentious topics, namely Aquinas' account of how the subject matter of metaphysics is established or discovered. Who would have thought there could be a family fight over that? But there is. And the most prominent debate on this topic is between two opposing camps of scholars. One I will refer to as natural philosophy Thomists, which includes the like of James Weishaupt, Benedict Ashley, William Wallace, and Ralph McInerney. The other I will refer to as the Separatio Thomists, which includes the like of George Klubertons, Leo Sweeney, and my late great Dr. Frater, Monsignor John F. Whipple of blessed memory. My labels here are intended to indicate that the first camp, the natural philosophy Thomists, maintains that the subject matter of metaphysics is, in a way, discovered through natural philosophy. By contrast, the second camp insists that it is discovered independently of that, simply through an analysis somehow of the ratio of being by means of the abstractive act that Aquinas terms separatio, hence the title of my paper. Now, this is not to deny that there are other approaches out there to this question, but this is the big debate that's out there. Now, despite the differences between these two camps, both agree on a number of relevant points that I want to acknowledge up front. If you look at Figure 1 on your handout, you'll see the points of agreement between them. Just to run through it very quickly, the subject of metaphysics is ens commune, being in general. Point 2, ens commune is participated or created being, so it doesn't include God under its ambit. Point 3, ens commune is non-material, meaning that its ratio neither includes nor excludes matter. Point number 4, the non-materiality of ens commune is discovered by means of the abstractive act that Aquinas terms separatio. On all 4 of those points, I'm going to be in agreement with the two camps. I'm going to break with them on points 5 and 6. So they agree on point 5 that to begin metaphysics, one must have scientific knowledge of the non-materiality of ens communae. And point 6, the subject of metaphysics, therefore, is established or discovered by an act of separatio. Now, given the agreement on this last point, you might be wondering, well, wait, why do I refer to only one of the two camps as Separatio Thomists? And again, it's because the emphasis on that camp, notably Whipple, is that Separatio, this act by which we discover the subject of metaphysics, occurs independently of natural philosophy. The natural philosophy Thomists are insistent that it's through natural philosophy. The debate suggests a strict dichotomy of options regarding interpreting Aquinas, but as I'm going to argue, it's something of a false dichotomy since Aquinas does not hold for P6, but instead presents a path to establishing the subject of metaphysics that does not entail separatio at all. More to the point, if my reading is correct, the debate isn't really even a false dichotomy, as though it's leaving out a third root. It's a variety of unintended red herring, so far from the miraculous sort of herring served as a meal to Aquinas in his last days. As it turns out, the focus of both camps on P5 turns out to be an unfortunate distraction, since the non-materiality of ens communae, in fact, I'm going to argue, does not play a role in Aquinas' account of the discovery of the subject matter of metaphysics. They're treating it like a precondition for beginning this science, and I'm saying, no, the discovery that being, the ratio of ens is non-material, that occurs within metaphysics itself. So you can see from the outline that my paper has 4 parts. I won't go into detail on all of them, but the first part concerns separatio and the division of the sciences. You can see a very involved table on page 2. Hopefully it makes things clearer and not more confusing if you at least spend some time with it. But here what I do is I present a visual of the locus classicus to which all of these Thomists are looking, Aquinas' commentary on Boethius' De Trinitate. In question 5, article 1, he considers the division of the speculative sciences. It's in question 5, article 3, that he looks at abstractive acts when considering how we arrive at knowledge of mathematical objects, but he runs through these 3 kinds of abstraction. The bottom 2 there are abstractive acts performed by the first act of the intellect, whereby the mind acquires an intelligible species. The top one, separatio, by the second act, it involves a judgment, a negative judgment, where we distinguish one thing by another by saying this is not that or this does not include that. That's the one that we're focusing on here. And Aquinas correlates these 3 acts of abstraction to the 3 speculative sciences. And so he correlates notably separatio with metaphysics. As I say, it's tempting to see this as these 2 camps of Thomists do, as saying, well, you need separatio to begin metaphysics. But rather, he just says that it belongs to metaphysics, and I take that as him saying that it is within metaphysics. As regards that division of the speculative sciences, the way that he goes about it, following Aristotle, so he's well aware that this division, as it's presented by Boethius, first appears in epsilon 1 of Aristotle's Metaphysics, and a consideration of the degree to which the items that are being studied, the objects, are related to matter in motion, both in reality and in thought and definition. So, it's tempting, as I say, to read this division of the sciences as a precondition for beginning the sciences. But here we need to pause and consider what's going on with this division. And my contention is that this presentation of the division of the sciences is itself a metaphysical investigation. For 2 notable reasons. Aquinas tells us, following Aristotle, that it belongs to metaphysics to order the sciences and to regulate them. So here, rather than a pre-scientific investigation, we have what I will refer to as a meta-scientific consideration. It is a reflection on the sciences as they have been engaged in. Another point to consider, Aquinas goes beyond both Aristotle and Boethius in presenting the rationale for this division by saying the note of immateriality that we're focusing on here, the degree to which the objects being studied are either present in matter or separate from matter. Why is that an issue? Well, because we're looking at the science as a habit. Habits are in the mind. The mind is immaterial. The intellect is immaterial. So the standard for presenting this division is that we're aware of the immateriality of the human soul. Aquinas makes clear that it belongs to natural philosophy to study soul in general and the human soul inasmuch as it's the act of the body. But inasmuch as it has an act that's independent of the body, the study of the human soul belongs to metaphysics. So the division of the sciences presupposes, the rationale for it presupposes that we have scientific awareness and acknowledgement of the immateriality of the human soul. That belongs to metaphysics. All of this is to say that this is a metaphysical division. Again, it's not pre-scientific. It's occurring within the science of metaphysics. So I want to bring up this point now. If you turn to page 3 of my handout and look at figure 3, there's a presupposition that's going on here with both the natural philosophy Thomists and the Separatio Thomists, what I label the separability awareness criterion. And I'm going to disagree with this criterion, but implicitly they hold that to begin the study of a speculative science, you have to already be aware of the degree to which its objects are separate from matter in motion. Certainly, both camps advance this view as regards beginning the science of metaphysics, as I note with P5. Their concern is that if we don't establish the non-materiality of ens commune, we're stuck with considering ens mobile, being that's mobile. That's the subject of physics. So how do we move beyond the subject matter of physics to see we need a distinctive subject matter? I'm going to return to that question in section 3. For now, I just want to highlight a problem that I see with the separability awareness criterion is that if the division of the sciences is established within metaphysics, and if the other speculative sciences receive their respective, as Aquinas puts it, modes of definition from metaphysics as principles, how does metaphysics receive its own mode of defining as a principle prior to the start of that science? So that's an issue I'll again cycle back to, but I think the simplest explanation is that Aquinas does not in fact espouse the separability awareness criterion at all for beginning either metaphysics or any of the speculative sciences. Let's consider this language of beginning a science or discovering its subject matter. That language indicates science as it is learnt. It indicates learning. Aquinas notes following Aristotle that in the order of learning, we have a different ordering of the sciences. Mathematics should be studied not only before metaphysics, but before physics as well. Why? Because it's learnt easily by the young, whereas physics requires experience. He provides no indication, though, that students of mathematics must first be made aware of the fact of the relation of their objects to matter and motion. I mean, I try and think of a kindergarten class and a teacher teaching arithmetic and, okay, kids, we're going to start to learn about number. But first, you need to know that numbers are present in matter and motion in reality, but separate from it in thought and definition. That's just not the way that mathematics is taught. And yet, one can proceed in mathematics with ignorance of that fact. Interestingly, Aquinas indicates implicitly the same is the case for the study of physics. In his commentary on Aristotle's physics, Aquinas begins in the first lectio by providing again this division of the sciences based on how the objects in the science are related to matter and motion. Okay, so we might think he's running with the presupposition that you need to know this stuff in order to begin the science. But then, after giving that, if I would call it pedagogical introduction to frame things for us, to make things easier to understand, he notes, the subject of this science is ens mobile, mobile being. But note this, and apologies, you're going to have to turn back to page 1 of my handout because of formatting issues. I had to locate text 1 there. After telling us that the subject matter of physics is ens mobile, Aquinas tells us the following, quote, I do not, however, say that the subject is mobile body, corpus mobile, since the fact that everything that is mobile is a body is proven in this book, and no science proves its own subject matter. If, as Aquinas notes elsewhere, every body has matter, it follows that this too must be shown within the science of physics. In other words, physics does not start out presuming that it's studying what's in matter. Rather, it starts out with what's evident to the senses, as Aquinas tells us in his first way argument from the Summa for the existence of God. It is certain and apparent to the senses that something is in motion in this world. What's not evident to the senses are the principles of motion. And that's what's established in physics, matter being one of them. Here, what I would argue, and what I'm driving at, is that the separability awareness criterion that's presupposed by these two camps of Thomists neglects a key distinction regarding Aquinas' use of the word science. Sometimes when he's using this term, he's speaking of science in its complete perfection, namely as a perfect habit. In this respect, he tells us, science entails knowing things distinctly and determinately. But at other times, when he speaks of science, he's talking about it as a discipline, as something that is in process of being learnt. And here he describes it as a motion, and he terms it, in this case, inchoate science, the disposition to the perfect habit. As incomplete, the learner's scientific habit is thus marked by indistinct and confused knowledge, and part of my contention is part of that confused knowledge at the outset of the science is how the subject matter is related to matter and motion. My contention is Thomists who presume the separability awareness criterion apply the standards of science taken as perfect habit to science taken as discipline. And what I'm arguing is that one such item of confusion at the outset, what I'm arguing is that as for mathematics and physics, so too for metaphysics, it need not begin with the knowledge of how ens commune, being in general, is separate from matter and motion. So I turn to section 3 of my paper, the science of being as divided by the categories. And so this is a text that I think needs really we need to focus on when we're examining this question of discovering the science of subject of the science of metaphysics for Aquinas. Commenting on Gamma 1, Aquinas provides an introductory outline of what is done in this chapter. So this is on page 3 on the handout. Text 2, we're told first Aristotle assumes that there is a science whose subject is being, ens. Second, he shows that it is not one of the particular sciences. Third, he shows that this is the science that is now under consideration. And here's the key line. He says, it is in doing these three things that Aristotle, quote, establishes, stabilit, the subject of this science. The language of establishing the subject of metaphysics here is noteworthy because, as far as I can tell, it is Aquinas' most explicit statement on this topic. Weishaupt, representative of the natural philosophy camp, insists, of course he's not looking at this text, but he's insisting on this thesis, quote, "It is natural philosophy that discovers the existence of separate substances, some non-material being, and thus establishes the subject matter of a new science, the science of being as such." But when we look at this text from the commentary on the Metaphysics, no mention is made of immaterial being, no mention is made of the non-materiality of ens commune, no mention is made of separatio. So, what are we to make of the concern that we haven't moved beyond ens mobile? We haven't transcended ens mobile. And here, again, I think there's a mistaken assumption on at least the part of the natural philosophy Thomists that to move beyond ens mobile, we have to move beyond the material to the immaterial. What I would argue is, if we look at the commentary on Gamma 1, is that the transcending that goes on in Aquinas' analysis is across the categories. Because as Aquinas proceeds to explain what Aristotle is doing, he brings out the analogicity of being across the categories. And so I'm running short on time, but I would just point you to text number 3 on page 3, where he says, Aristotle shows that it belongs to this science to consider both substance and accidents, and he provides us, Aquinas identifies in the text, a demonstration, and he parses out the major premise. Whatever universally receives one predication, even though it is not predicated of those things univocally, but analogically, belongs to the consideration of a single science. Minor premise, being, ens, is predicated in this way of all beings. Therefore, it belongs to the consideration of a single science that considers being in as much as it is being, namely both of substances and of accidents. Yes, physics studies accidents too. But what it doesn't do is say, what do accidents share in common with substances, which are the subjects of accidents? Moreover, what it doesn't do is say, what do motions share in common with substances, which are the subjects of motions? In fact, Aquinas, as he proceeds in his treatment of the analogicity of being, walks through further declining senses, telling us how being is predicated not only of substance and accident, but of motions as well, and even beings of reason as well. So I'll stop there, and we'll field questions now. Yes?
I have a question. Well, the quote that you got from Metaphysics 4, that seems to be in the order of discovery. We should attend to what happens in Book 6. Because that is, and he set aside being as true and being as accidental in Book 6?
Yes, he does, but he still treats categories as real beings.
Okay.
So the categories of accidents as real beings, and he still sees motions having real being.
But I mean, why does he set them aside in the study of metaphysics from Book 6 onward?
Well, as I take it, it belongs to metaphysics to be able to step back and say, how do we use is in all these cases? And then our primary focus is on real being. Now we've run out of what we're supposed to do with seeing is as the sense of true, and then hand that on to the logician.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much. Hey, thanks, Greg.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I just had a quick question, maybe to kind of push your interpretation in a way that I don't know if you've explored. But so I'd like your clarification that the separability awareness criterion kind of conflates two different understandings of science: science as the perfected habit, and science as the discipline. How does this apply? This is where I want to, expand this further. How does this apply to our understanding of separatio and abstraction? Because
Right.
so I think there's an issue in talking about these as operations of the intellect. We think about them as an act.
Yes.
Like one act, you do it,
Yeah.
and now I can do math. Separatio. Now I can do metaphysics. How much are these, like separatio, abstraction? How much are these acts, or how much are these kind of methods? The methodology of the science.
Yeah, good, thank you. So this is the way I'm viewing it, is that as regards those first two acts of abstraction, as we commonly hear it presented, it involves abstracting a form from a phantasm. And so we acquire something. We acquire an intelligible species. But here we're dealing with separatio, with a judgment. So I think that goes to what you're saying. And what's interesting is in these texts, Aquinas uses the language of considering. So I didn't have time to get to that point in my paper, but as I'm seeing it, we already have abstracted, and there are texts where Aquinas speaks this way according to the first operation, the concept of being. What we're doing with that second act is considering that ratio further, and we're saying this does not belong to it, namely matter. It's neither material nor it's immaterial. And in fact, that's one of my other arguments is if it turns out that the ratio of being is neither material as such nor immaterial as such, but is open to either, we've got a disjunction here that being as such is either material or immaterial. Well, this turns out to be what he calls a passio entis, a property of being. And properties of a subject are deduced within the science. So I think there's an irony. If we presuppose it up front, we somehow are presupposing the subject in order to figure out the subject. This strikes me as problematic. So I'm sympathetic with saying it's through an analysis of the prime mover as an immobile being that to discover that it's immaterial that we make this negative judgment, but I think that's taking place within metaphysics. And I'm sympathetic with Whipple's separatio argument about the ratio of substance, but that's taking place within metaphysics. So it's dealing with consideration of what we've already grasped. Does that go to your question? Yeah, okay, yes. Oh, Father Steve.
Well, first of all, thanks. I think the best. I just wonder how you deal with the text, which I think the natural philosophy people often refer to in book 6. If there were no separate substances, then natural philosophy would be first philosophy.
Yeah.
How do you understand?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see that as, so I have it on here because it's a challenge text, right? I didn't have time, but it's on my handout. And so if you look at on the, let's see, page 5, that's text number 7, is that statement about natural philosophy. Well, first of all, notice the language is about first philosophy. And Aquinas has made clear in the Proemium that the name first philosophy is given to this science because it studies the first beings. The name metaphysics because it comes after the science of physics and it concerns the communia. So one way of reading is it's just saying what would be the first beings, and he's not making a claim that therefore that would be, the science of the communia. What I find interesting is when people bring out this text, I don't find any of the scholars saying, well, this is a per impossibile thought experiment, because if there were no separate substance, well, physics would be the highest science, but nothing would be in motion if there were no separate substance. So we have to delimit it, and I think what's being brought out here, as a response to this challenge text, though, I would point out texts 8 and 9, where Aquinas makes clear also within the metaphysics, in text 8, he says that text 8, lines 8 through 10 there, it belongs to this science, metaphysics, to investigate whether or not there is something apart from sensible substance. And then in text 9, again, we're in book 11 of the Metaphysics, Aquinas is commenting on that. He says, Aristotle has not yet proven that any immaterial substance exists. So if that's the case, and you need to know that separate substance exists to begin to do metaphysics, what's Aristotle been doing these past 10 books? So I think as challenging as text 7 here is to my thesis and, from the natural philosophy Thomists, it has to be balanced out and read in light of these other texts. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, just a quick question. So it's clear that to do metaphysics, we have to move beyond ens mobile and movement in physics to mathematics and so forth. So my question concerns mathematics. I mean, it seems that, of course, Aquinas didn't know calculus, but there is a kind of movement implied in mathematics. It's certainly in calculus, right? And so the question is, does Aquinas ever contemplate the notion of an ever greater, ever subtler movement as we ascend the scale of being, so to speak? Or does it just go increasingly towards ever greater stasis?
Yeah, I have to confess that would be outside my wheelhouse, the details of his philosophy of mathematics, but I'm not aware of him talking about motion in considerations of mathematics as such. Maybe applied mathematics, what it's being applied to is in motion, but
I'm getting it all the way up to the Trinity and the processions, you see. So
okay.
It's a question of movement. Is movement only corporeal, or do we not have to posit?
Oh, okay. We wanted to limit the sense of the word movement here, motion, to the act of that which is in potency in as much as it's in potency. But if we're going to extend it to say it's the reduction of potency to act, then we can extend it analogically. But I think the relevant sense in which he's saying objects and the relationship to matter and motion, the sort of motion that entails having matter. Yeah.
Yeah, we have time for one more.
Thanks very much, Greg.
Yeah, thank you.
You have a lot going on here.
Yeah, sorry.
That's easy to see. But,
fire hose of information.
So, but the question I have is, what's the role of the human soul? You mentioned it very briefly, that the consideration of the human soul. Could you expand on that a bit?
So the rationale for the division of the speculative sciences, science is a habit, and powers and habits are determined by their object. And so since the power of which science is a habit is the intellect is immaterial, the objects that we're considering for different habits of sciences must have some degree of immateriality. And so I'm saying if the rationale for the division of the sciences is based on the degree of immateriality of the objects, but how do we know that? What's our basis for claiming that? It's because of our knowledge of the immateriality of the human soul. How do we know that? Well, we have to prove that. How is that proven? It's proven within metaphysics. So what I'm saying is the foundation for the rationale for the division of the sciences presupposes that we've established that the human soul is immaterial.
I believe that's in the first book of Avicenna's Metaphysics.
Okay.
I'll show you the text later.
Thank you, yeah. And he's very clear that this distinction he's bringing out between immaterial beings, or being taken to talk about the immaterial, and being taken as what I'm labeling the non-material, he says in commenting on Epsilon 1, this is from Avicenna. So, yeah, the Avicennianism is clear. Okay.
Thank you very much. Okay, and our third speaker, it's Father Stephen Brock. He's a priest of the Prelature of Opus Dei and professor of medieval philosophy at the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome. Since 2017, he has been a visiting professor of philosophy at the University of Chicago. Most of his research has been on the ethics, action theory, and metaphysics of Thomas Aquinas. His paper today is titled Scotus' Framing of Individuation, a Pitfall for the Thomists.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, this paper is work in progress. In a sense, it's also work in regress, which I hope that will be, what I mean by that will become clear as I go ahead. My ultimate goal in this work, which I don't reach in this paper, is to arrive at a position from which to be able to assess the difference between the teachings of Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus on the principle of individuation, specifically of bodily substances. That's what I'm focusing on. By principle of individuation, I mean something very specific. I mean that which is added to a specific nature so as to contract it to a singular instance. So, for instance, what is added to dog
to get this dog, to get Fido. Okay. So I proposed 3 theses in the paper. All 3 of them are addressed mainly to readers of Thomas. One, which I present toward the end, I'll mention at the end, is a proposal about what the root of the difference between the 2 positions is, between Thomas and Scotus. Another thesis, which is really my main one in this paper, is that for quite a long time, the interpretation of Thomas on individuation has been infected with a mistaken assumption. And the bulk of the paper consists in showing why it's mistaken and why that matters. The third thesis is what my title actually refers to, and it's not something that I can strictly prove, although I think there's pretty good evidence for it, and it's of some interest in relation to the main claim and to my ultimate aim, certainly. It's that the aforesaid assumption took hold among the Thomists in the course of their efforts to respond to Scotus as a result of how he framed the issue. Okay? This is just a conjecture, but it's in effect that they kind of let Scotus set the agenda and fell into the trap of defending a position that their master did not hold. So I begin with a sketch. I hope it's uncontroversial. If there are any Scotists here, I'd be glad to be corrected about this. A sketch of Scotus on individuation. Here, let me just state what, for my purposes, are the most salient points. I can't go through the whole sketch. On Scotus's view, and in contrast to that of St. Thomas, the real constitution of an individual substance corresponds quite closely to its logical constitution. That is, to the factors that enter into the concept of it. And regarding individuation, I can spell that out, but there isn't time. But regarding individuation, one way in which they correspond, the real constitution and the logical constitution, is crucial. And this is that for Scotus, in the individual substance, there's a reality that is not in its own being individual. This is the substance's common specific nature. For instance, the humanity in Socrates. In Socrates, humanity in its own being is not individual. According to its own being, it's indeterminate in number. It carries what Scotus calls less than numeric unity. Secondly, again, in the individual substance itself, the common nature is naturally or constitutionally prior to the factor that determines the substance to numeric unity, which is to say the factor that individuates the substance. This ultimate individuating factor is Scotus's principle of individuation. In different places, he uses different expressions to designate it. The most famous one, of course, is hechetas, which literally just means thisness. For my purposes, we need to notice certain features that Scotus ascribes to this principle, to the hechetas. First of all, it's purely singular. It's purely singular. It presupposes the common nature that it individuates, but no common nature is intrinsic to it or predicable of it. Right? Secondly, it constitutes a true differentia, and sometimes he calls it that, the individual differentia. And it closely resembles a specific differentia. For example, just as a specific differentia is proper to one species, to the species that it differentiates, the individual differentia, which is constituted by a hechetas, is proper to one individual. And at least in his questions on Aristotle's metaphysics, Scotus holds that the common nature and the hechetas together constitute a true and proper individual essence. There is such a thing as Socrateity, Socratetas. He actually used the word Danielitas. He gets that from Richard of St. Victor. And such an essence can in principle be expressed in a true and proper definition. In the Ordinatio, he backs off from that, but he says that in the questions on the metaphysics. Socrates can be defined, and not only insofar as he is a man, but insofar as he's Socrates. For my purposes, two other things stand out about Scotus's treatment of individuation. One is his explicit stipulation of what the principle of individuation ought to do. It ought to serve, he says, as that by which an individual, for instance, Socrates, is, quote, singular with this proper and determinate singularity and not with the singularity of Plato. As Tim Noon puts it, what Scotus sought was, quote, the total cause of the individual identity of the thing. Right? So he sought, so to speak, the very you-ness of you. Right? We could make a song for that if you want, but maybe there is a song, but I think maybe there is. The other thing we should notice is his rejection of a number of candidates for the principle of individuation. He does not name Thomas there. But the two of the candidates do bring Thomas to the minds of many readers, including Scotus's editors. They cite a lot of passages from Thomas. These two candidates are prime matter and dimensive quantity. And it's true, quite often Thomas calls the principle of individuation for bodily things designated matter. And he holds that the designation of matter is made possible by dimensive quantity. Scotus offers a lot of arguments against prime matter and against quantity. Let me just mention three. One is that the prime matter in a substance cannot individuate that substance because it's not proper to that substance. Right? It belongs successively to a multitude of distinct substances which come into being and pass away. The matter enters into all of them. And at least in living substances, the matter itself is in flux. They change in the prime matter that they have. A second argument is that quantity is a mere accident and cannot be a constitutive factor of a substance. And a third argument is that neither matter nor quantity is a purely singular entity. Both have common natures. They need something else to individuate them. The principle of individuation must be something else. Okay, so much for Scotus. In the next section of the paper, I say some things about the reactions to Scotus by Thomists in the scholastic period. It's here that I offer some evidence, again, not conclusive, I think, to suggest that the Thomists let their accounts become overly conditioned by that of their adversary. I focus mainly on John Capriolas and also on Cardinal Cadgeton. Capriolas argues that prime matter in itself has no common nature. It is a purely singular reality. That's his view. Cadgeton strongly disagrees with Capriolas' account. But he insists that designated matter does establish a true individual differentia. And both of these claims, to me, they look like efforts to satisfy Scotus's criteria. And in my opinion, both of them pretty clearly clash with St. Thomas. However, as I said, I'm only offering that as a conjecture about the reactions to Scotus, and it's not really my main concern anyway. My main concern arises more from an overview of the panorama of interpretations of Thomas on individuation, from Scotus's time down to the present day. Obviously, I have not been able to examine all of them. I don't think that would be possible. But I've looked at a good number of them. At least I've looked at 8 major scholastic thinkers and 23 from the last 100 years. So I've looked over a number of them. And to me, 2 things stand out. One is just the great diversity among these interpretations on many fronts as to the proper roles of matter and quantity. Padgett and Capriolas already disagree about that. Which of them has priority? What's their mutual causality or lack of it? How quantity designates matter, whether the dimensions of dimensive quantity are determinate or indeterminate, whether designated matter individuates only synchronically or also diachronically, and so on. So it's a real cacophony of voices. Right? There's just a lot of disagreement. And to me, that suggests that maybe something is wrong. And the other thing that I've noticed is that there is a point in which just about everybody agrees. Almost everybody. And I have to add that until recently, I did too. I also held that point. Until I saw the light, so to speak. It's the assumption that I mentioned before. I think that this goes far to account for why there is so much discord, this assumption. And it does reflect something in Scotus's treatment, which maybe explains how it got its foot in the door. The assumption is very simple. It's that the designated matter that serves as the principle of individuation is designated prime matter. That's the assumption. It seems implicit in nearly all the authors that I looked at, and it's quite explicit in many of them. For example, two very distinguished readers of Thomas have recently written that for him, the principle of individuation is, quote, materia prima signata quantitate. Now, they put it in Latin, and that makes it sound like a quotation, doesn't it? But in a search with a variety of wildcards and spaces and stuff, on the Index Thomisticus at corpusThomisticum.org, a search indicates that Thomas never says that. In fact, he never even says materia signata quantitate. He never says that. He only says materia signata, or sometimes materia designata. And in several places, he does connect the designation of matter with dimensive quantity. So that's okay. But he absolutely never says that the matter in question is prime matter. That is, he never says that it's the kind of matter that Scotus attacks. What does he say? Very often, to illustrate designated matter, Thomas recurs to Aristotle's example of what individuates the human species. Haec carnes et haec ossa. This flesh and these bones. In several places, he speaks of sensible designated matter. In others, he makes the principle of individuation to be the individual's body. All of these things can count as matter for Thomas. We must not forget that his term materia is neither absolute nor univocal. Right? It is relative and analogical. So then I make some remarks about designated matter. Let me just make 3 points here. Your designated matter is proper to you. No one else can have it. Your body is proper to you. That's what I mean. Right? No one else can have your body, and you can have no other body. But it's not a pure singularity. It's not an individual differentia. It has a common nature, right, which is part of human nature. Right? In other words, your flesh is flesh. Right? It has the general nature of flesh in it. And it's added to the human nature not as a differentia, but as a sensible object is added to an intelligible object that is attributed to it. Designated matter is matter that you can point to. That's all it means. This body, here and now. Right? Sorry, I keep pointing to Professor Gorman, but you're an excellent example for what I'm saying. It's sensible matter as sensible. And the correlative form, matter is always correlative to a form, right? The correlative form is an intelligible form. My final section concerns the scope of the difference between Thomas Aquinas and Scotus on this. When they ask what is added to a common nature to individuate it, they're not really asking the same question, it seems to me, because they disagree about the ontology of that nature itself. For Scotus, the nature has a certain community, as I said before, within the real individual, and it is really prior to what individuates it. For Thomas, there is nothing common in the individual. This is a quote from the De Ente et Essentia. I think he carries through with this the rest of his career. In Socrates is not found any commonness, but whatever is in him is individuated. The nature is common for Thomas only insofar as it's an object of understanding. It becomes such an object through abstraction. Only as abstracted does it need something else to individuate it. What does it need? Well, I think the same sort of thing as that from which it was abstracted. Some sensible object to which it can be attributed. The common nature is prior to its individual instances only in thought. And so is what individuates it. Obviously, your body already contains your individual rational soul, which is what makes you human. But the perception of it, the sensible perception of it, is logically prior to the application to it of the common concept of human nature. For Scotus, the question of what contracts a common nature to an individual is the same as the question of what constitutes the individual's identity. For Thomas, they are not the same question. Thomas does occasionally speak of individuation in the sense of the constitution of an individual's identity or ratio. In this sense, he says that the individuating principles of a man are this flesh and these bones and this soul. He includes the soul in certain cases. Your particular soul is certainly part of your identity, but it is not a hexeitas. In fact, taken together, your soul and your body, or your soul and your flesh and your bones, just are you. And in this sense, I think we can say for Thomas, you individuate yourself. What makes you you is you. There's nothing in you that is more singular than you are, in which you merely share. Your identity is not an abstraction, in other words. At least that's my read. So I end with two questions, one for Scotists and one for Thomists. I think the question for Scotus would be, how is it that a singular form received in matter cannot be multiplied by the mere division of the matter with the proper ratio of that form remaining unvaried? Okay. Why not? Why can't you just multiply it with the same ratio, just by dividing the matter? For Thomists, the question is how to answer Scotus's arguments for a real ingredient in things that has less than numeric unity, for a real community in the individual. That's the real question. I don't find it addressed very much. I think that's the real root of the difference, the philosophical root of the difference between the two positions on individuation. Thank you.
So we start the Q&A.
Thank you, it was great. Just two questions. So it seems that you end up by saying that, according to Aquinas, a principle of individuation is just this flesh and bones and the soul. But then what account for the identity over time? And what is the principle of individuation in the afterlife?
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Identity over time in the afterlife. Well, as I say, I think that you can say that if that's what designated matter is, that's preserved throughout your life. You have the same body throughout your whole life. Okay? You don't have the same prime matter, maybe, but that's not what he's talking about. Okay? There's a really important passage in the De Generatio e Corruptione, which Thomas comments on, where Aristotle talks about the same thing being able to be taken both as matter and as form, and he talks like bone. Right? So you have like your shin bone. Your shin bone is made of bone. Right? But you can look at it either from the point of view of the kind, it's a shin bone, or from the point of view of the matter. Right? And he says the matter can change, the matter of the bone. Now the bone, I'm saying, is matter for the human being. Right? But the matter of the matter can change, but that's kind of incidental. It's the proper matter. And Thomas says this, we should look at the proper matter of the individual. This bone, this heart, this brain. And those don't change, I think he's saying. You know, there's a, I don't know if you know the joke about the lawyer. He's examining a witness and he shows him a photo. And he says, is that you? And the witness says, yeah, that's me. And he says, were you present when this photo was taken? Think about that. And the witness says, yeah. And he says, was that the same nose that you broke as a child? Now think about that. Is that the same nose you broke? Well, of course it is. I've always had the same nose. I haven't. Right? Now we can talk about changing noses and stuff, but that's kind of the idea. The afterlife is a hard one. Obviously, I really don't want to get into that too much. This is hard enough as it is without going into that. I mean, Thomas just says that the soul retains the same being that it had in the body. The being that it had in the body was the form of being to be the form of that body. Even after death, it's still the form of that body. Even though the body that it's the form of is not there. I think that's what I would say about that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So my question is about common nature. So in your perspective, what is at this point, like I can see from your talk now the difference between Scotus on common natures and Aquinas on common nature, but what would make Aquinas still a realist about essences than with respect to like a nominalist approach to the essence?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. What's the difference between Thomas and Occam?
Yes.
Right. Well, the nature that we understand in a common way is in the individual, right? But it's individuated in the individual, right? It's the individual humanity, right? It does sound more like Occam, that's true. I think Occam's real opponent is Scotus. His primary opponent, anyway, is Scotus. But I think I can still distinguish pretty clearly between Thomas and Occam because, see, if I understand Occam right, somebody can correct me here, that Thomas at least is saying that there is an intelligible form. There is a form which, as intelligible, is universal. Right? Occam gets rid of those too. He doesn't want universal forms anywhere, in reality or even in the mind. He's got singular entities which can function as signs that can stand indifferently for a bunch of individuals. Right? But there's no common form, even as an object of intelligence. So Occam will say that forms in themselves are singular. Right? Occam says that. Right? Thomas will say a form in itself is able to be predicated of many. But the form in itself, what is that? You only have forms in themselves as objects of thought. Right? They don't pre-exist either as Platonic objects or as Avicennian combination, anything like that. That's what I would say.
So would be right to say that it's potentially common, the nature for Aquinas, just potentially common. Like,
yeah, it's potential, just the way it's potentially intelligible.
Yes.
Yeah, same thing.
A question and then a suggestion. The question is, it seemed like you were saying that the principle of individuation is a principle in the order of understanding. And then I was wondering why, if that's true, Aquinas has this very strange and distinctive view that you can't have more than one angel in a species because there's no principle of individuation to differentiate two angels from each other. And then a suggestion, is this in accordance with what you're saying. It seems to me that there are actually two different questions that people are talking about when they're talking about individuation. One is, what makes something to be an individual? And maybe Aquinas' answer to that is, look, any being is one. If you got a being, it's an individual. That's my answer. And then another question is, what allows there to be two entities of the same kind? And it seems like that's a little bit of a different question.
From the first question?
From the first
Oh,
question.
sure, yeah, that's what I'm saying, yeah.
So what do you do with the case of angels?
Okay, I'm not sure I understood the question, though. The question is, why is that a question?
So if the principle of individuation is just functioning as a principle in our understanding, then why does the lack of matter prevent angels from being? Why can't you have two angels? You know, it's just a matter of determining
Well, but angels are, it's not that there's no principle of individuation, it's the angel's own form individuates it, right? Because it can't be divided. It's indivisible. It's not in matter, and there can only be one of that kind, okay? But it's still one of many because you have many, you have the genus, which is common to all the angels, the genus of angels, and the form that puts the angel in that genus also individuates it within that genus. And that's a purely logical distinction between it's purely logical there, okay, between the genus of the angel and the differentiator that you get from the form, because it's the same form that constitutes both. Okay.
So we have one last question within this for him, and then we have the open panel for the three of them, and you can ask questions to the three.
Hello. This is a variation of the afterlife question. It's said that every 7 years, every molecule in your body is different from the you that was here 7 years ago. So what is it that unites today's you from 7 years from now you?
I do. I think would be my basic answer, but it's my soul and my body.
Okay, so the
soul matter of my body differs, but it's the same body and it's the same soul.
Different body, because it's...
No, it's not. It's different in matter, but not
in what
Not
sense?
as this body. It's this same body. I've had this same body all my life. I would want to say that.
But if you took a picture of yourself as an infant and
no,
now...
qualitatively it changes and it's moving. It's different
Right.
now. It's in a different place than it was.
Okay.
But it's substantially the same body.
And I'll stop everybody because I know we're on to the next thing. But it's substantially the same body. However, if every molecule is quite literally different, and I see you shaking your head no, so you must have an answer.
Well, I suppose we'd have to go. I mean, this is the ship of the ship of Theseus and all that. We'd have to go into the ontology of molecules at this point and whether I'm really a substance and that sort of thing to answer that fully, I think, which I can't really do.
Another session.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so now you're free to ask questions to any of the three of them. So we're going to start from here.
It's a follow-up from the previous discussion. But, one thing that I noticed that Aquinas always says, determinate matter is the principle of individuation regarding the beginning of individuation, in coatio. Because then the body is the same because the soul unites it and gives being to it afterward. But you are right, the body is the same, but it's the same because the soul is the one that gives the being to the body. Yeah, I think that's
Yeah, I think I was agreeing with that when they asked me about the afterlife. But it's a question of how do you understand the being of the soul? Right? The soul is individual according to its own being. But what does that mean, the being of the soul? I mean, I think it means the soul's actually being the form of this body. That is the being of the soul. It's to be the form. So the body is in the notion of the soul, is referred to in the very being of the soul. And that's true even when the soul is separated from the body. Okay? That's how I'd understand it.
So, hey, Father Rocca. So my question, I think, is another way of getting at Andreas's earlier question. So what kind of distinction do you think holds between the principle of individuation and the individuated thing? When you were talking about kind of the order of knowledge, it made it sound like you think it's a logical distinction. But if there's a merely logical distinction between the principle of individuation and the individuated, then it looks like we could do the same. We can have a logical distinction for angels as well. But if it's a real distinction, then I'm not quite sure how your solution works.
Okay. Distinction between what and what?
Principle of individuation and the individuated thing.
The individual.
Yeah.
Not the individuated nature, the common nature.
Yeah.
Which?
The individual.
Okay. Well, okay, I would say that in the case of the angels, there's only a logical distinction there, right? That the because it's just the form. The angel is just the form. If I understand designated matter, and for Thomas, the individuating principle, which is individuating relative to the common nature, because in the real thing, there's nothing that needs to be individuated, right? But it's only a part of the individual. It's the body of the individual, which is only a part. Okay? So that's a real distinction between but it's not by functioning as a part of the individual that it individuates that individual. If we talk about individuating an individual, that sounds to me more like asking for the identity of the individual. And there I'm saying it's the body and the soul. It's the whole individual.
Yeah, I think that's your answer to Andreas.
Okay, thank you. All right. There you go. Got it.
So I'm wondering about, well, I've been thinking about your question to Thomists, and I'm wondering, I didn't have a chance to write it down, so if I'm slightly off base, that's probably why, but I'm wondering if it goes back to the way that, like, the unity, but the similarity between different creatures goes back to the way that they're modeled after the divine ideas, right? Because we're all modeled after the same part, like, going back to your book, Dr. Doolan, like, we're all modeled after, similar, the same divine perfections, but there's individuation in the form of each creature that exists. So there's a continuity in the analogous sense, to which we're related to God, but not a united form that's present in each creature. Does that answer?
Well, that's certainly true. That's important. But I don't think my question was really. I didn't have time even to bring it out. But I would like to see addressed the arguments that Scotus gives for a common nature within the individual itself, not the ideas in God and not anything. But he argues that within the individual itself, there's something that in a certain way is common. And he has argument. He has reasons. He has argument like reproduction and some other things. Yeah. And how do the Thomists answer that? That's how I would. That was my question.
Can I make a quick comment on that?
Sure.
I think one of the reasons you don't see a lot of Thomist answers to that Scotus view that each individual has a nature that's common in itself is that a lot of Thomists actually agree with that.
Yes,
on this point, they're Scotus. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to continue the temporary tradition of addressing all the questions to Father Brock. So I take it that you were, one of the texts you must have been looking at was Thomas's commentary in the De Trinitate by Boethius.
Yeah, there.
I know that because I did like a little independent directed study on that. But, and this is where Boethius establishes, and Aquinas seems for the most part to agree with Boethius. Obviously, sometimes his commentary, little differences creep up. But Boethius establishes that for individuals to be distinct from each other, there has to be a difference of some sort. And of course, this answers a question about angels. So Boethius very convincingly argues that against the distinction in material substances being that of a, when there's multiple individuals within a species, he argues convincingly against the possibility of that difference existing in the substance because they share the species. And very convincingly argues then that the difference must be on the accidental level. He gets to that simply by ruling out other options. And then since angels, this sort of leads us to why angels cannot be distinguished. And this does, it's not surprising that people are puzzled about the soul, how this individuation of the soul after death works, because it seems to me that Aquinas' explanation of that, at least at first, maybe I'm just not smart enough, but it seems incompatible with his usual explanation about individuation. But anyway, my actual question, given the importance of Boethius in Thomas for this whole question, did Scotus reference Boethius when he addresses the question?
He does refer to that, yeah. I'd have to go back and look and see what he says. Yeah, he's very clever, right? And he's got a way of making, I don't remember what he says about Boethius, to be honest with you. But he says that when Aristotle says that things are individuated by matter, he says, well, by matter, Aristotle means what I mean, which is the hikaitos, right? He just says that with a straight face, right? So he's good at that. But I'd have to go back and look and see what he says. Thank you. I'll do that. That's good. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question for Michael. If we can remember it back there. It's a while ago. So I sort of wondered if, so you started with a very clear setup to your paper, which I'm maybe going to abuse because it was about counting, right? And you asked if there was some one individual that would correspond to, you know, is there, like, the average height of the room is 6'5", which is pretty tall, but you know, and then there wouldn't be one individual that you could pick out, and so some of the distinctions that you made seem to deal with that, especially the kinds of, well, I'd say Group A, the categories and beings text most clearly correspond to what you could individually pick out and count, or maybe quantify over, or something like that. Whereas a lot of the other three groups seem to deal more with what is being in the primary sense as opposed to a secondary sense. And to me, those struck me as kind of different questions. And I'm wondering, are those two different questions, and is there an easy way to relate them? Because kind of your hypothesis seemed to be a little bit of a Frankenstein monster, like mashing those together. So I wonder how those questions are related, or am I thinking about it the wrong way?
Yeah, we may have to talk about this in a little bit more detail. I didn't mean actually to bring in countability as an important criterion. I just meant with my example of this, you know, you have two sentences like the average person is 6'5", the tallest person is 6'5". In both cases, you have what appear to be definite descriptions, right? Singular referring expressions that pick out exactly one instance. But I wasn't trying to bring in the idea that in order to be a being, you have to be a countable object. That's a different issue. It's a very interesting issue. It sounds right until it stops sounding right, but I just wasn't even thinking about that.
Okay, we don't have any more time. Let's thank our speakers.